The doctor's hands were shaking as she switched off the ultrasound monitor mid-exam. She locked the office door and whispered, "Laurel, leave your husband right now before he destroys you." I laughed, thinking it was a joke, until I saw the file. My husband hadn't spent $50,000 preparing for the baby. He spent it bribing the clinic to swap the samples and frame me for infidelity just to steal my inheritance. He thought I was a weak victim, but he didn't know I already had a gift awaiting for him, or in front of 50 witnesses. The doctor's hands were trembling. I watched her, transfixed, as her gaze lingered on my medical file rather than the ultrasound screen where my baby's heartbeat flickered, a tiny, rhythmic pulse of silver against the black. She wasn't looking at the life inside me. She was staring at the name printed in crisp letters at the top of the intake form, Julian Vance. Suddenly, she reached out and killed the monitor. The screen went dark, as if someone had abruptly severed the power to my entire future. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "I need you to come with me to my office. Right now." She led me down the hall, her movements stiff and urgent. Once inside, she shut the door and turned the lock with a definitive, chilling click. My heart hammered against my ribs, the sound echoing in my ears like a heavy drum. I was certain she was about to tell me I'd lost the baby. I couldn't draw a full breath. The room felt as though it were shrinking. Then, she spoke the words that shattered my reality. "You need to leave your husband today, before you even think about going home. Find a divorce lawyer before the sun sets." I let out a short, hysterical laugh. "What? Why would I do that? We're having a child together. We're happy, Dr. Aries. I don't understand any of this." The doctor's face was as pale as bleached bone. "That is precisely the problem," she replied. "What I'm about to show you will dismantle everything you believe about your marriage. My name is Laurel Sterling. I'm 32, a creative director at a high-end architectural firm in Aspen, Colorado. I come from what the locals call a legacy family. When my grandmother, Margaret, passed away 5 years ago, she left me her entire estate, a $3 million trust and the ancestral Sterling Manor, a sprawling Victorian where 5 generations of women had built their lives. I never made a show of it. I worked 50-hour weeks, drove a 10-year-old Jeep, and stood in line for my own coffee every morning. To me, the inheritance was a safety net, not a personality. But I realize now that to someone else, it was a bullseye. I met Julian Vance 4 years ago at the conservatory's annual winter fundraiser. It was a black tie affair my family had shared for decades. I was hiding by the bar, trying to dodge a man who had asked about my financial portfolio within 3 minutes of introducing himself. Julian appeared like a breath of fresh air. Tall, with dark hair and a smile that seemed effortless, he asked what I was drinking and made a biting comment about the atrocious jazz band. He didn't mention money once. He claimed to be a simple wealth manager who'd snagged a last-minute invite from a colleague. He acted as if the Sterling name meant nothing to him. In hindsight, that should have been the first warning sign. A financial professional attending a major philanthropic event without researching the host? It was a calculated move, a performance designed to make me feel safe from the usual vultures. I was so tired of gold diggers that I fell for the act completely. We dated for a year, and Julian was a dream. He was attentive, he remembered my favorite obscure poets, and he always insisted on the check, even though I could have bought the entire restaurant. He felt genuine. My mother, Beatrice, was the only one who saw the cracks. After their first dinner, she cornered me in the hallway. "That man's smile doesn't reach his eyes, Laurel," she warned. "There's something hollow in him. I can feel it in my gut." I dismissed her as cynical and overprotective. We fought over Julian until the silence became a wall between us. For 2 years, we barely spoke, trading nothing but polite texts on birthdays. I chose a stranger over the woman who raised me. And God, it hurts to admit she was right. Julian and I married a year later at the manor. He wept during his vows, tears streaming down his face as he promised to love and protect me forever. Looking back, those were likely the only honest tears he ever shed. They weren't born of joy, they were tears of pure relief. His long game had finally reached the finish line. After 2 years of trying for a family without success, we turned to a fertility specialist. The news was devastating. Julian was diagnosed with severe male factor infertility. His count was nearly non-existent, and what little remained was stagnant. Natural conception was a mathematical impossibility. Julian seemed broken. He sat in the car and cried for 20 minutes, apologizing for failing me as a husband. I held him, telling him we'd figure it out together, that our marriage was more than just biology. I had no idea then that he wasn't mourning a loss. He was recalculating. His plan had hit a snag, and he was simply adjusting the variables. We settled on IVF with a specialized injection procedure. Julian insisted on researching the clinics himself, claiming he wanted to take the burden off my shoulders because I was so emotionally drained. I thought he was being a supportive partner. The first round failed, and I spent days in bed, unable to move. Julian was there, whispering reassurances, promising me would try again. The second cycle, 7 months ago, was the miracle we'd prayed for. 2 pink lines. I was overwhelmed with joy, already planning the nursery and imagining the future. Julian was right there with me, though he casually mentioned that I should probably update my will now that we were starting a family. I thought it was just practical, responsible. I didn't realize he was already mentally spending my grandmother's money. I lived in that beautiful lie for months, never suspecting that the man sleeping beside me every night was the one who had set the fuse to my life. I had no idea that a stranger with shaking hands was about to hand me the match. Julian took over the logistics for the fertility treatments, selecting a specialized clinic in Denver he insisted was the gold standard. He handled every form, every signature, while I was lost in a fog of hormonal injections and fading hope. When the first cycle failed, I spent 3 days paralyzed by grief, unable to even look at the sunlight. Julian was my anchor then, whispering that we would try again, that he wasn't going anywhere. 7 months ago, the second cycle took. Seeing those 2 pink lines felt like the world finally coming into focus. I wept with a joy so pure it felt holy. Julian held me, already painting pictures of nursery themes and college funds. It was in one of those tender moments that he casually suggested I should update my will. Now that we're a real family, he'd said, it's just the responsible thing to do. I thought it was endearing, the mark of a man who was finally thinking about a legacy. I had no idea he was already mentally inventorying my grandmother's antique silver and calculating the interest on my trust. Everything seemed flawless, the devoted husband, the miracle on the way, the life I'd dreamed of since I was a girl playing in the Sterling Gardens. I couldn't see the fire Julian was building right under our feet. By the time I was 4 months pregnant, the atmosphere in our home had turned brittle. It started with small, jagged changes. His phone was always face down on the nightstand. There was a new passcode I didn't know. He started taking calls on the patio in the dead of winter, returning with vague stories about portfolio restructuring at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night. I might not have been a high-stakes trader, but I knew the markets didn't run on weekends. Unless Julian had opened a secret office in Singapore, none of it made sense. Then came the receipts. A dinner for two at a downtown bistro I'd never visited, nearly $300. A charge for a boutique hotel in the city, barely 40 minutes from our front door. When I confronted him, Julian had an answer for everything, delivered with a practiced, terrifying smoothness. A client dinner. A networking event. The hotel was for a conference that ran late. He didn't want to drive home exhausted and risk an accident. When I pushed for more, his voice would sharpen. Laurel, you're being paranoid. It's the hormones. My mother warned me about this, how women lose their grip during pregnancy. Don't turn into one of those wives. He made me feel small, as if my intuition were a symptom of a disease. I ended up apologizing to him for his own secrecy. That was his greatest talent, turning my common sense into a character flaw. Soon, the financial requests became more aggressive. He wanted to be added to the Sterling Trust. He talked about power of attorney as if it were a romantic gesture. In case something happens during the delivery, he'd say, I need to be able to protect the baby's future. It's just common sense. Unless you don't trust me. He even suggested selling the manor, claiming it was too large for us and that he could invest the proceeds into high-yield funds that would maximize our returns. The man who couldn't remember which streaming service carried his favorite show wanted me to hand him the keys to a $3 million legacy. When I refused, gently but firmly, Julian's warmth vanished. He became a ghost in our house. He started sleeping on the very edge of the bed, claiming I moved too much. The silent treatments would last for days, ending only when he realized he was hungry. His principles, it seemed, had a time limit, and that limit was an empty stomach. He stopped touching me entirely. He blamed my changing body, saying he was afraid of hurting the baby. It sounded like concern, but it felt like a cold, systemic rejection. When I tried to talk about the distance between us, he dismissed me as needy and difficult. I began to wonder if I really was the problem, if the pregnancy had somehow broken the woman he'd fallen in love with. I didn't know then that he was just waiting for the clock to run out. One night, I woke at 2 a.m. to find the other side of the bed cold and empty. I found Julian in the kitchen, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight, hunched over his phone. He was speaking in a jagged whisper. It's almost time, he was saying. By spring, the whole thing will be settled. We just have to wait. When he noticed me standing in the shadow of the hallway, he hung up instantly. Work emergency, he said, his voice flat. Go back to sleep, Laurel. I didn't ask who had emergencies at 2 a.m. regarding things being settled. I was too exhausted, too deep in the fog of my second trimester, and too desperate to believe the wreckage of my marriage could still be salvaged. My best friend, Chloe, came over for lunch the following Tuesday. She sat across from me at the mahogany kitchen table and watched as I spent an hour constructing elaborate excuses for Julian, the billable hours at the firm, the pressure of his new accounts, the looming weight of fatherhood. Finally, she set her fork down and looked at me with the piercing clarity of someone who had known me since our freshman year at Boulder. Laurel, listen to yourself. When was the last time you actually spoke to your mother? I didn't answer. And when was the last time Julian was happy to see you? I don't mean the theater he puts on for the neighbors. I mean genuinely, bone-deep happy that you walked through the door. I had no answer for that either. Trust your gut, Chloe said. Something is rotting in this house. I told her she was being dramatic, but that night, sleep wouldn't come. I kept thinking about Julian's phone, always face down, and the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching, not with love, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a man solving a difficult equation. At 4 months pregnant, I went to my routine ultrasound alone. Julian had a client meeting in Vale he claimed was non-negotiable. My regular doctor was away on leave, so I was scheduled with a partner in the practice, Dr. Sarah Thorne. I laid back on the exam table, the gel cold on my skin, waiting for the familiar sight of my baby dancing on the screen. Dr. Thorne was professional, making quiet small talk as she prepped the equipment. But when she opened my digital file and saw the name Julian Vance, she froze. Her hand, gripped around the ultrasound wand, began to shake. She looked at me, then back at the name on the screen, her complexion turning a sickly shade of grey. Without a word, she reached over and killed the monitor. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice barely a thread. "I need to speak with you in my office. Right now." The panic hit me like a physical blow. I was convinced the baby was dead. I followed her into her office, and she locked the door behind us with a trembling hand. "I know what your husband did," she said. "And I have the evidence." She pulled a thick manila folder from her desk drawer. "My younger sister, Maya, is a head nurse at the fertility center you used," Dr. Thorne explained, her breathing shallow. "3 weeks ago, she came to my house in the middle of the night, hysterical. She told me everything. When I saw your husband's name on your file today, I knew I couldn't let you go home without knowing the truth." She laid the folder open between us, and the life I thought I was building turned to ash. Maya had been drowning in debt, student loans, medical bills, a life slipping through her fingers on a nurse's salary. 7 months ago, Julian had approached her. He was charming, polished, playing the role of a desperate husband. He told her there was a delicate genetic issue in his family that he didn't want to burden me with, and that he wanted to use a donor without my knowledge to spare my feelings. He offered her $30,000 to switch the samples. He'd bought off the embryologist as well with a separate payment. Between the two of them, the fraud was seamless. Julian's sperm, which he knew was useless, was discarded and replaced with a sample from a paid donor. The embryologist had told Maya not to worry, that it wasn't their business how a husband chose to manage his marriage. As the months passed and the pregnancy took hold, the weight of the lie began to crush her. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. Every time she saw a successful pregnancy in the clinic records, she saw a woman carrying a child she believed was her husband's. The guilt had finally broken her. I sat in that office, the air feeling thin and cold, listening to Dr. Thorne explain how my husband had spent $50,000 to frame me for a betrayal I hadn't committed. $50,000. It was more than he'd spent on our entire wedding. I finally understood where his priorities had always been, and they were never with me. Dr. Thorne laid out the timeline of the scheme, her voice steady even as the horror of it filled the room. It was a masterpiece of malice, constructed over 18 months. Phase 1 was complete, the bribe, the switch, and the silence. Phase 2 was the waiting game, playing the doting father to be while I carried a child that wasn't his, building a public persona of the perfect, supportive husband. Phase 3 was the surgical strike on the truth. Julian had already arranged for the embryologist to scrub the clinic's digital records, making it appear as though our second IVF cycle had failed. This would leave only one possible explanation for a successful pregnancy: natural conception. Phase 4 was the trap. After the birth, Julian would suggest a sentimental DNA test to honor our journey, a keepsake for the nursery. And Phase 5 was the kill shot. When the test proved he wasn't the biological father, and the records showed the IVF had failed, he would have undeniable evidence that I had cheated. The Sterling family prenup was a fortress, designed to protect 5 generations of wealth, but Julian had found the one weakness. It contained a strict infidelity clause. If either spouse were proven unfaithful, they would owe the other a $500,000 penalty. Furthermore, the wronged party would forfeit all claims to joint assets and could sue for additional emotional damages. Julian's endgame was chillingly clear. He was going to walk away with a $500,000 windfall, destroy my reputation in the close-knit Aspen social circles, and likely strip me of everything my grandmother had worked to preserve. He was counting on my shame and my desperation to protect my child to make me compliant. He thought I would simply hand over the money to make the nightmare go away. He almost succeeded. Dr. Thorne pulled more documents from the folder. Meyer had been thorough in her guilt. She had saved everything. There were original lab records showing the switch, the donor's ID number, and payment logs that could be traced back to offshore accounts Julian controlled. There were even email threads, clandestine exchanges between Julian and the embryologist. They had used private servers and coded language, but the intent was unmistakable. Meyer had also tracked down the donor, Caleb Reed, a 28-year-old doctoral student in Denver. He'd been paid $15,000 in cash. A standard donation usually paid a few $100s. $15,000 should have been a screaming red flag, but student loans have a way of silencing intuition. Caleb had been told it was a private arrangement for a high-profile couple who required absolute discretion. When Meyer finally contacted him and told him he was an unwitting participant in a fraud, he was livid and ready to testify. But there was one final piece of the puzzle Dr. Thorne had uncovered through a private investigator. Julian wasn't just greedy, he was desperate. He had accumulated over $180,000 in gambling debts. He'd been losing for years, online poker, high-stakes sports betting, and weekend business trips to Las Vegas that were nothing more than frantic attempts to win back his losses. The $50,000 he'd used for the bribes hadn't come from his savings. He had embezzled it from his own clients at the wealth management firm, siphoning off small amounts over time, hidden behind a veil of complex accounting. His partners had no idea yet. Julian wasn't just trying to steal my inheritance, he was a drowning man grabbing at a life raft. The people he owed money to weren't patient bankers who filed polite paperwork, they were the kind of men who solved debts with violence. I was supposed to be his payout. My grandmother's legacy was supposed to be his salvation. I sat in that office for what felt like an eternity, the papers spread across the desk like a map of my own destruction. First came the shock, cold, paralyzing, and hollow. Then came the clarity. Every late night, every secret call, every push to access my trust, the pieces finally clicked into place. Our chance meeting at the fundraiser wasn't an accident. Julian had researched me before he ever offered to buy me a drink. He knew exactly what the sterling name was worth before he ever learned my middle name. Even those tears at our wedding, I had thought they were born of love. I realize now they were tears of relief. The predator had finally caught his prey. And my mother, Beatrice. The woman I had pushed away for 2 years, the woman I had called paranoid and bitter. She had looked at him once and seen the truth. His smile doesn't reach his eyes, Laurel. She had tried to warn me, and I had chosen a con man over the woman who had spent 30 years protecting me. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even feel the urge to go home and confront him. Instead, a cold, sharp resolve settled in my chest. Julian thought I was an easy mark. He thought that because I was pregnant and vulnerable, I would crumble under the weight of his trap. He thought he was playing a high-stakes game of chess and that he was 3 moves ahead. He had no idea who he had actually married. I looked up at Dr. Thorne. He doesn't know that I know? No, she replied. My sister hasn't said a word to anyone else. And I only made the connection when I saw your name on the schedule this morning. Good, I said, gathering the documents and tucking them back into the folder. I need copies of everything. And I'm going to need to speak with Meyer directly. Dr. Thorne watched me, her expression a mix of pity and admiration. What are you going to do, Laurel? I stood up, resting a hand on my belly. I thought of the child inside me, innocent, blameless, and already loved. My husband thinks he's already won, I said, my voice as cold as a mountain winter. He's about to find out that I've already flipped the board. I drove home from the clinic with my face a mask of practiced neutrality. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, my breathing even and rhythmic. Julian had installed a high-end security system 2 years ago, cameras at every entrance, motion sensors in the halls. At the time, he told me it was for my protection, a necessity for a woman living alone in a sprawling estate like the Sterling Manor. Now, I realized it was surveillance. He was likely watching the feed on his phone, looking for a tremor in my lip or a stiffness in my gait that might suggest I'd finally caught the scent of his rot. I gave him nothing. He was waiting for me in the kitchen, leaned against the marble island with that effortless, cinematic smile. My mother's warning from 2 years ago, the one I dismissed as bitter and overprotective, rang in my ears like a funeral bell. How was the scan? He asked, his voice a perfect melody of concern. Is our little one doing okay? I smiled back. I walked right into his personal space, wrapped my arms around his neck, and kissed him. I showed him the ultrasound photo Dr. Thorne had printed, the one she'd taken before she realized whose file she was holding. Perfect, I murmured against his cheek. Everything is exactly as it should be. I deserved an Academy Award for that performance. I sat across from him at dinner, sipping sparkling water and asking about his day while mentally calculating the cost of his future legal defense. I laughed at his jokes while picturing him in a courtroom. I even apologized for my paranoia over the last few weeks, leaning into the very same excuse he'd used to gaslight me, the hormones. I watched the tension leave his shoulders. He leaned back, his confidence restored, thinking he'd successfully managed me once again. He thought the prey was still safely in the trap. That night, he slept soundly beside me, his breathing deep and untroubled. I lay awake until 3 a.m, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, drafting the blueprints for his destruction. The next morning, I called my office and claimed a sudden bout of morning sickness. Instead of resting, I drove 2 hours south to Colorado Springs, checking my rearview mirror every few miles to ensure I wasn't being followed. I had found a private investigator named Eleanor Vance, no relation to Julian, which felt like a cosmic irony I couldn't ignore. Eleanor was a former lead detective with 15 years on the force before she'd gone private. She was all sharp angles and steady eyes, the kind of woman who wasn't impressed by old money or polished smiles. I told her everything. She listened without a single interruption, her pen flying across a legal pad. When I finished, she gave me a cold, predatory grin. Your husband made a lot of mistakes, Laurel, she said. Arrogant men always do. They think they're the only ones in the room with a brain. Give me 2 weeks. She didn't need 2 weeks. She called me in 10 days. Julian's gambling debts were even worse than Dr. Thorne's sister had suspected, $180,000 owed to offshore betting sites and to private lenders, the kind of men who don't report income to the IRS and don't take kindly to late payments. The embezzlement was also confirmed. Eleanor had tracked $53,000 siphoned from client accounts over the last year and a half, moved through a series of shell companies Julian had set up. His firm was still in the dark, but the trail was bright enough to follow if you knew where to look. And then, there was the affair. 8 months. It was his assistant, a girl named Brooke who was barely 24. Eleanor had it all, Time-stamped photos of them entering boutique hotels, records of romantic dinners charged to a client development, even text logs that were as pathetic as they were incriminating. The assistant. Of course it was the assistant. I felt almost insulted by the lack of imagination. If you're going to dismantle your marriage and commit multiple felonies, the least you can do is avoid the most tired cliché in the book. Having an affair with your assistant is literally chapter 1 of the unfaithful husband's handbook. Not that such a book exists, but if it did, Julian would have had it bookmarked. Eleanor had found something else, too. Julian had a history. 5 years ago, in Seattle, he'd dated a woman named Catherine Holloway, another heiress, another trust fund. They had been together for 6 months before she'd caught him trying to transfer funds from a joint account. She'd been too embarrassed to press charges, opting instead to pay him off just to disappear. Eleanor had tracked her down, and Catherine was more than willing to provide a sworn statement now. She'd spent half a decade waiting for someone to finally pin him to the wall. I met with Meyer, the nurse from the fertility clinic, in a quiet coffee shop an hour outside of town. She looked like a ghost of herself, frail, pale, with deep bruises of exhaustion under her eyes. The guilt was clearly eroding her from the inside out. She started crying the moment I sat down. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed, her hands shaking so hard she couldn't hold her mug. "He was so convincing. He told me it was about protecting you from a genetic disorder. I needed the money so badly, and I thought." I cut her off. I wasn't there for her apology. "Are you willing to testify? On the record?" She nodded frantically. "Anything. I've already contacted a lawyer to discuss turning myself in. I can't live with this anymore. I'll tell them everything. The bribes, the embryologist, the samples. Everything." I looked at her for a long beat. She was a co-conspirator. Yes. She had taken $30,000 to help a man steal my life. But I could see that Julian had played her just as expertly as he'd played me. He'd found her desperation and used it as a lever. "Don't be afraid, Meyer," I told her. "You're not the villain here. You were just another one of his tools." The embryologist, once he realized the walls were closing in and that Meyer was cooperating, developed a very sudden and convenient conscience. He provided Eleanor with a full statement in exchange for the hope of reduced charges. He was terrified of losing his license and spending his middle age in a federal cell. Then, I made the hardest call of all. I called my mother. 2 years of silence. 2 years of choosing a predator over the woman who had spent my entire life as my fierce, uncompromising advocate. The phone rang twice. "Laurel?" Her voice was cautious, vibrating with a hope she was clearly trying to suppress. "Mom," I said, and my voice finally broke. "You were right. About everything. And I am so sorry." There was a long silence on the other end. I braced myself for their "I told you so." I expected the anger, the lecture, the righteous fury of a woman who had been ignored. Instead, she simply asked, "What do you need, sweetheart?" She didn't gloat. She didn't remind me of the warnings I'd walked over. She just stepped back into her role as my protector. My mother is a retired litigator, a woman who spent 30 years dismantling corporate frauds. Within 48 hours, she had me connected with the most ruthless divorce attorney in the state and a criminal prosecutor who specialized in financial racketeering. My mother taught me something that day: the people who truly love you don't need to be right. They just need you to be safe. Julian had never understood that. To him, love was just another currency to be traded, a means to an end. He'd spent 2 years convinced he was the smartest person in every room. He was about to learn that the Sterling women didn't just inherit money, we inherited a legacy of survival. The trap was set. Now, I just had to wait for the party. Beatrice didn't just provide comfort, she provided a war room. Within 48 hours, she had connected me with Diane Rousseau, a woman who had spent 3 decades dismantling the egos of powerful men. Diane was barely 5 feet tall, with a cap of silver hair and a collection of cashmere cardigans that made her look like a retired librarian. It was a brilliant camouflage. In reality, she was the most lethal divorce attorney in the Mountain West. She reviewed the mountains of evidence Eleanor had gathered, the clinic's original logs, Meyer's sworn confession, the financial trail to the offshore accounts, and the hotel surveillance footage of Julian and Brooke. When she finally looked up from the last page, she gave me a thin, satisfied smile. "Your husband isn't just looking at a mess of divorce, Laurel," she said, her voice like sandpaper on silk. "He's looking at multiple felony counts. Conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement. And this plan to falsify the clinic records after the birth? That's evidence of intent for a separate felony entirely." She explained how the Sterling prenup would now become Julian's gallows. The very infidelity clause he had hoped to weaponize against me would now be triggered by his 8-month affair with his assistant. Instead of me owing him a $500,000 penalty, the clause would now be turned squarely on him, though we both knew he didn't have a cent of his own to pay it. Diane coordinated seamlessly with the criminal prosecutor. Meyer provided a formal, sworn statement to the police, her voice recorded and transcribed as she detailed every clandestine meeting with Julian. The embryologist, desperate to save his own skin, turned over the encrypted messages Julian had sent him. Next, we quietly alerted the managing partners at Julian's firm. They were horrified. A wealth management firm lives and dies by its reputation for integrity, and here was a partner siphoning funds from client portfolios to pay off gambling debts and bribe medical staff. They didn't hesitate. They immediately froze Julian's access to all company systems and accounts, launching an internal audit that would surely uncover every penny he had stolen. A judge reviewed the preliminary evidence and found more than enough probable cause. An arrest warrant was issued for fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement. Diane called it a mere formality at that point. I called it the first true breath of fresh air I'd taken in years. 6 weeks after that fateful ultrasound appointment, I suggested to Julian that we host a celebration. A garden gala at the Sterling Manor. I told him it should be an afternoon party for our families, close friends, and his senior partners to celebrate the upcoming arrival of the baby. I saw his eyes light up with that predatory gleam I now recognized so clearly. He saw it as a stage, more witnesses to his performance as the devoted husband, more people to feel sorry for him when his unfaithful wife was eventually exposed. "That's a wonderful idea, darling," he said, kissing my temple with that practiced, hollow tenderness. "Let me help with the arrangements." "No," I said, patting his arm with a smile that matched his own in its falsity. "You've been under so much stress at work lately, with all those late nights. Let me handle everything. You just show up and look your best." He had no idea that my version of a handling everythinger involved a team of plainclothes officers stationed in the guest house, my legal team positioned near the buffet, Caleb Reed waiting in the study, and a folder of evidence that was about to turn his life into a crime scene. The party was set for Saturday. I watched him that morning through the crack in the bathroom door as he practiced his father-to-be smile in the mirror, adjusting his tie and rehearsing the look of joy he'd later trade for a look of devastation. He thought he was walking toward his greatest triumph. He had no idea he was walking toward his own execution. The Sterling Manor was resplendent in the late spring sun. My grandmother Margaret's gardens were in their peak, a riot of mountain wildflowers and heirloom roses that had survived a century of Colorado winters. White linen tents billowed on the south lawn, and the sharp scent of chilled champagne mingled with the floral air. A string quartet played softly near the fountain, their music drifting over the 50 guests who moved across the grass in their Sunday best. Julian's parents had flown in from Virginia, beaming with pride at their successful son and his beautiful, glowing wife. Margaret would have loved this party. She also would have seen through Julian in the time it took to pour a glass of tea. She had an instinct for the hollow places in people, a gift for spotting a counterfeit that I had apparently failed to inherit. Julian was in his absolute element. He moved through the crowd with the polished charisma of a career politician, shaking hands, offering easy laughs, and ensuring he was always in the frame for every candid photo. His hand rarely left my belly. Every time a camera clicked, he was there, gazing at me with a look of such profound adoration that I almost felt a flicker of pity for him. Almost. The feeling vanished the moment I remembered the $50,000 he'd siphoned from his clients to buy my destruction. His mother, a soft-spoken woman who clearly idolized him, kept dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. I always knew he'd be an incredible father, she told a group of our neighbors. He's so protective, so devoted. Laurel is a lucky woman. Julian's father walked beside him, his chest puffed out, proud of the legacy he thought his son was building. Meanwhile, my own mother stood near the refreshment table, watching Julian with the patient, terrifying stillness of a predator waiting for its prey to wander into the tall grass. She caught my eye and raised her glass an inch. It was time. Around 3 o'clock, Julian did exactly what I knew he would do. He'd been rehearsing this for weeks, dropping subtle hints about wanting a meaningful way to celebrate our biological connection. He raised his voice just enough to ensure the nearby group, including his boss and his parents, would be focused on us. You know what we should do, Laurel? He pulled me close, his arm a heavy, proprietary weight around my waist. I've been thinking. We should get one of those ancestry and DNA kits. We could frame the results for the nursery. A testament to the Vance bloodline. Proof that daddy and baby are connected forever. Wouldn't that be special? A few of the guests let out collective sighs of appreciation. His mother's eyes welled up again. I played my part to perfection, looking down with a shy, hesitant smile. Oh, Julian, I don't know. It seems like a lot of fanfare for a party. Nonsense, he said, his voice ringing with a false, cinematic sincerity. It would be amazing. We could even make it a part of the celebration today. What do you think, everyone? There was a murmur of encouragement from the crowd. Someone called out about how thoughtful he was. Another guest mentioned they wished their husband had half as much sentiment. Julian was practically vibrating with triumph. He could already see the finish line. He could taste the $500,000 and the sterling trust. He thought the trap was finally snapping shut. He just didn't realize that I was the one holding the key. Instead of reaching for a test kit, I stepped toward the small cedar platform we had positioned near the fountain, the one intended for the evening's toasts. I picked up the microphone, the cold metal grounding me. Julian smiled up at me from the front of the crowd, his champagne glass raised in a silent salute. I could see him mentally rehearsing his role, preparing the shattered expression he would wear when the faked records eventually proved his devoted heart had been broken by an unfaithful wife. Thank you all for joining us today, I began, my voice clear and unwavering, carrying across the manicured lawn. This gathering was meant to be a celebration of family and the future. But more than that, I wanted to be a celebration of the truth. I found Julian's eyes. A hairline fracture appeared in his composure, his smile tightening at the corners. I reached beneath the podium and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. 3 months ago, I discovered something that dismantled everything I thought I knew about my husband and our life together. I'm sharing it now because Julian is right. Today is about connection. And there is no real connection without honesty. Julian's smile didn't just fade, it froze. His champagne glass stopped mid-air, a few inches from his lips. Many of you know we struggled to conceive. Julian was diagnosed with a condition that made natural conception an impossibility. So, we turned to a fertility clinic in Denver. I held up the first document, the white paper stark against the green of the gardens. These are the original logs from that clinic. The unaltered history of our journey. I let the word original hang in the silent air. Julian's face went the color of ash. These records prove that my husband bribed a nurse and an embryologist to switch his own sample with that of a donor. He paid $30,000 to ensure I would carry a child that wasn't his, all without my knowledge or consent. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Julian's mother gripped her husband's arm so hard her knuckles turned white. Near the back, someone's glass hit the flagstone patio and shattered with a sharp, crystalline crack. He paid $15,000 to a young man named Caleb Reed, I continued, gesturing toward the side of the house. Caleb stepped forward, a tall, somber grad student who looked nothing like the man standing in the center of the lawn. Caleb believed he was helping a couple in need. He had no idea he was a pawn in a fraud designed to destroy me. I swept my gaze over the crowd, landing on Julian, who looked as though he was struggling to breathe. Julian's plan was meticulously crafted. He was going to wait until the birth, demand a DNA test, and when the results approved he wasn't the father, he would claim I had cheated. He knew our prenup had a $500,000 infidelity clause. He was going to use my child as a weapon to strip me of my inheritance, destroy my reputation, and walk away with the sterling legacy. Julian finally found his voice, though it was strangled and thin. Laurel, honey, stop. This is insane. You're confused, the stress of the pregnancy, the hormones, you aren't thinking clearly. I'm not finished. My voice was as cold as a mountain spring. The crowd went deathly silent. To fund this masterpiece of betrayal, my husband embezzled $53,000 from his own clients. I looked directly at the senior partner of Julian's firm, who was standing by the bar. His face was a mask of cold, professional fury. The firm has already been notified and is conducting an audit as we speak. Julian's boss set his drink down with a definitive thud. Furthermore, I said, pulling out the surveillance photos, Julian has over $180,000 in gambling debts. And for the last 8 months, he has been siphoning what's left of our life to maintain an affair with his assistant, Brooke. I held up the photographs, the hotel entrances, the intimate dinners, the undeniable proof of his double life. Julian's mother made a soft, wounded sound, like she'd been struck. This wasn't even his first attempt, I added. 5 years ago in Seattle, he targeted another woman named Catherine Holloway. That ended when she caught him stealing from her, though he managed to escape justice then. She has provided a sworn statement and is ready to testify. Julian's glass finally slipped from his fingers. It exploded on the stone at his feet, spraying expensive champagne over his polished shoes. Those are lies, he stammered, looking wildly at the faces around him. She's unstable. The pregnancy has broken her mind. Is any of this true, Julian? The voice was his mother's. It was quiet, but it cut through his frantic defense like a blade. Julian opened his mouth to lie to her one last time, but no sound came out. He looked at her, then at the silent, judging faces of his peers, and he simply collapsed inward. Meyer, the nurse, stepped out from the guest house, her face pale but her eyes steady. "I'm the nurse he bribed," she said, her voice amplified by the silence. "I have the records of every payment. I've already spoken to the authorities." Caleb Reed spoke next. "He told me it was a private arrangement for a high-profile couple. I didn't know I was part of a crime until Laurel's investigator found me." Julian looked around like a trapped animal. The colleagues who had toasted him 10 minutes ago were now backing away as if he were contagious. The society friends he had cultivated so carefully were staring at him with a mixture of horror and disgust. Then, 2 plainclothes officers stepped out from the shadows of the veranda, walking calmly across the lawn. "Julian Vance?" the first officer said, his voice a low, professional drone. "You're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent." The officers handcuffed Julian right there in the center of the lawn, the metal clicking shut with a sound that seemed to echo through the sudden, absolute silence of the gardens. His mother began to sob, a jagged, heartbroken sound that tore through the afternoon air. His father refused to look up, his gaze fixed on the flagstones as if he were trying to disappear into the earth itself. As they began to lead Julian away toward the waiting cruiser, he tried one last time. The mask of the predator had slipped, replaced by the desperate, frantic face of the performer he had always been. "Laurel, please." His voice cracked, raw and high. "We can work this out. I made mistakes, I know, but I love you. I've always loved you. Don't do this to us. Think about our baby. Think about our family." I looked at him then. I really looked at the man I had shared a life with for 3 years. I saw the man I had defended against my own mother's instincts, the man who had stood at an altar and promised to cherish me while he was mentally calculating the interest on my trust. "You're absolutely right, Julian," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "We just worked it out." I watched the patrol car drive away, its tires crunching over the long gravel path, past the heirloom roses my grandmother had planted half a century ago. It disappeared through the iron gates of the estate Julian had wanted so desperately to possess. Behind me, 50 guests stood in a state of suspended animation. Then, my mother walked up and draped her arm around my shoulders. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. Margaret would have been, too. For the first time in months, I felt my lungs expand. I took a full, deep breath of the mountain air. Julian was denied bail. The judge cited him as a flight risk, noting that between his gambling debts and their private lenders Eleanor had uncovered, there was a high probability he would vanish before the trial. Once the news of his arrest hit the local papers, those creditors lost their remaining patience. They had been willing to wait while Julian was married to a sterling heiress, but the moment they realized the money train had derailed, their interest turned sharp and dangerous. His assistant, Brooke, resigned from the firm the very next morning. She didn't even bother to clear out her desk or collect her personal items. She simply sent a 1-sentence email and vanished. I've seen rats leave sinking ships with more grace. She didn't wait for the handcuffs to find her, too, she just ran. Julian's firm completed their internal audit within 2 weeks. $53,000 were confirmed missing, siphoned through a labyrinth of shell accounts. They filed their own criminal charges immediately. Catherine Halloway, the woman from Seattle, came forward publicly once she saw the headlines. She had spent 5 years feeling foolish and humiliated, too ashamed to seek justice. She wasn't ashamed anymore. Her testimony provided the final, damning layer to the prosecution's case. The divorce was finalized in record time. Julian's legal team tried to negotiate, but they had no leverage. The sterling infidelity clause, the very trap Julian had planned to spring on me, worked entirely in my favor. He had been unfaithful for 8 months. He owed me the penalty, not the other way around. Of course, he had nothing to give. Every asset he'd claimed to own was either borrowed, embezzled, or entirely imaginary. The criminal trial was swift and brutal. Meyer testified. The embryologist cooperated fully in exchange for a lighter sentence. Caleb Reed provided a harrowing account of how he'd been misled. The paper trail Julian thought he had scrubbed was reconstructed piece by piece. Fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, every charge stuck. Julian's parents stopped attending the hearings after the first week. His father released a terse statement through a representative, saying that Julian had made choices no parent could defend. His mother checked into a private facility in Virginia for exhaustion. Julian Vance, the man who had walked into my life with such calculated charm, was sentenced to several years in a federal penitentiary. When he eventually walks out those gates, he will have nothing. No career, no fortune, no family to welcome him home, and a criminal record that will ensure he never targets another woman like me again. The trap he had built so patiently had snapped shut on his own neck. My daughter was born 4 months after the gala. She was healthy, perfect, and entirely innocent of the wreckage that preceded her arrival. Some people asked if I planned to contact Caleb Reed, to offer him a place in her life. I thought about it, but Caleb was a 28-year-old student who had made a desperate mistake for money he needed. He wasn't ready to be a father, he didn't want to be, and I didn't need him to be. My daughter would have me. She would have my mother, finally back in our lives where she belonged. She would have the legacy of the Sterling women, the strength, the history, and the house that had seen 5 generations of us survive. That was more than enough. I learned something through the fire Julian set. Family isn't about biology or DNA charts. It's about who stays when the world turns cold. It's about the people who choose you every day, especially when it's hard. My mother chose me when I didn't deserve it. I chose my child when the circumstances were impossible. We have lunch every Tuesday now, making up for the 2 years we lost. She has never once said, "I told you so." Not once. I finally asked her why. She just smiled over her coffee and said, "Because watching you dismantle that man was more satisfying than any 4 words could ever be." I laughed, a real, deep laugh that felt like sunlight. I sat in my grandmother's kitchen this morning, the same windows where she'd watched the seasons change for 50 years. I made myself a cup of the herbal tea she loved, her favorite blend. My phone buzzed on the counter with a text from my mother, "Lunch tomorrow?" I smiled and typed back, "Always." Outside, the gardens are in full bloom. The roses my grandmother planted, the lavender my mother tended, and the new seedlings I've started for the next generation. Julian Vance tried to steal my future, my peace, and my name. All he actually did was show me exactly how much sterling blood was in my veins. My grandmother used to say that we don't break, we bend. We adapt. And when someone tries to burn us down, we rise from the ashes and build something stronger. Julian thought he married a target. He married a sterling. And now, he has a very long time in a small cell to think about that mistake. Family isn't defined by a genetic sequence. It isn't about biological markers or a shared profile on a laboratory chart. Real family is about who shows up when the world turns cold, who stays when the shadow lengthens, and who chooses you every single day, even when that choice is difficult. Especially then. My mother chose me when I hadn't earned her grace. I chose my daughter when the circumstances were a labyrinth of lies. That is the true weight of the word. Beatrice and I have lunch every Tuesday now, reclaiming the 2 years we lost, one conversation at a time. She never once said she told me so. Not a single time. Eventually, I asked her why she'd spared me the lecture she had so clearly earned. She set her coffee cup down and gave me a slow, satisfied smile. Because watching you dismantle that man was more satisfying than any 4 words could ever be. I laughed then, a real, bone-deep laugh that felt like shedding a heavy winter coat. 3 weeks after the party, I sat in the kitchen as the dawn broke over the mountains. It is my kitchen now, in the house Julian had coveted with such hollow, frantic greed. The morning sun poured through the same windows that had watched for generations of sterling women navigate their lives. I made a cup of chamomile using my grandmother's favorite blend, the steam curling into the quiet air. Some traditions are worth the effort. My phone buzzed on the marble counter. It was a text from my mother. Lunch tomorrow? I smiled and typed back, always. Outside, the gardens were vibrant, waking up to the spring. There were the roses Margaret had planted as a young bride, the hydrangeas Beatrice added the year I was born, and the lavender border I had helped tuck into the earth when I was 10 years old. I could still remember my small, dirt-smudged hands patting the soil around each seedling while my grandmother told me stories about our family. I rested a hand on my belly, feeling the life within me stir. Julian Vance had tried to strip me of everything, my reputation, my peace, my future. All he actually did was reveal the steel I'd forgotten I possessed. Some people wait a lifetime for karma to arrive. I was fortunate enough to deliver mine in person, with documentation, in front of 50 witnesses. Margaret used to say that sterling women don't break. We bend. We adapt. We endure. And if someone tries to burn us down, we simply rise from the ashes and build something more beautiful. Julian thought he had found an easy mark. He forgot he had married a sterling. And now, he has a very long time in a quiet cell to contemplate exactly how much he underestimated me.